Hello there! Welcome to the channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. You're all so special to me, and I'm so thrilled you've joined me this evening. And as usual, we got to part 2 of our story, and it just gets so exciting, doesn't it? And I just love these stories, and I hope you do too. And if you haven't heard part 1 of the story, please do, because you don't want to miss out on the whole story. So let's get started with part 2 of our story. It all began when me and my brother decided to explore the woods, not far from my uncle and aunt's cabin. I'd never before walked through a huge congregation of tall, lofty trees like this before. Of course, I'd visited parks in New York, but this was entirely different. It was a magical experience. It was like opening up an exciting page of a book and wondering what treasures you would find in its midst, what you'd end up reading about. We were hugged by trees on every side that towered above our heads like masterful, imposing, verdant giants, shading us like vast open umbrellas from the heat of the midday sun, and offering us the privilege of enjoying a scant peppering of gossamer light, to trespass elegantly through the sculptural boughs, so that the forest floor, the shrubs, the woodland flowers, the fallen leaves and twigs were covered in a shimmering golden glaze, as if all the vegetation had been sprinkled with golden dust. And that is magical, whatever way you look at it. "This is incredible," my brother said, and I wholeheartedly agreed. But things got more incredible when we discovered a blusterous, rather boisterous stream that thundered exuberantly over the rocks and meandered through the wood grove. The vociferous, spirited, fast-moving, icy-cold water was so loud it was almost deafening. When we reached the stream, we could hardly even hear our own voices, as the loud sound of the water drowned out any competing noises. Me and my brother hastily shed our shoes and socks, eagerly running to the shallow end of the stream. We began to paddle in the water. The legs of our chinos rolled right up to our knees. The water was icy cold, refreshing, very exhilarating. Me and my brother began playing in the water, giggling and laughing. We ran after the fish that darted by, and were simply impossible to catch, despite our very best efforts. Try catching something slippery. It just glides through your fingers like butter, and eludes you. We threw pebbles and chased a leaping frog in the water, and that was when we heard the strange whistling sound, that despite the dominant sounds of the water was clearly audible to us. Me and my brother immediately stiffened. Who was whistling in the woods? It sounded as if the whistler was only feet away from us, but no one should be here on my uncle's private property. So if someone was out there, they were clearly trespassing. Me and my brother scrutinized the trees that surrounded us, but nothing was there. "Maybe it's a bird," my brother said, looking at my befuddled expression and trying to appease my rising level of angst. My brother knew only too well. If I got a bee in my bonnet about something, I found it hard to let go. "That is not a bird," I told him. "That is definitely not a bird. It's something else. Someone is there, and they're watching us. I know they are." I could feel an uneasy shiver prickling the hairs on the back of my head. I could feel eyes that I could not see boring into me. "Don't be silly," said my brother. "No one is watching us, because nobody is there, are they? There's no one on the river bank. If there was, then I'd believe you. You're imagining it, that's all." I felt disquieted, but despite my reservations, me and my brother continued to chase after this leaping green frog that was grabbing the focus of our immediate attention, making us both laugh. The little critter could jump impressively high. It was almost like he was toying with us and saying gleefully, "Catch me if you can, but you never ever will." His big throat was rising up and down, and he was watching us through his black eyes. All of a sudden, something went flying above our heads, and then landed on the stretch of water close to the bank, on the opposite side of the stream. I wanted to see what it was that had been thrown into the water. Was it a bird that had flown over us and dropped down into the water, I wondered? I couldn't be sure. We forgot all about the frog, and me and my brother ran hurriedly towards the object in the water, and I discovered it was an old straw hat, floating above the surface. That was when I realized unequivocally that someone must have thrown the hat into the water. But who? I told you someone's on the riverbank, watching us. They must have thrown the hat into the water, I told my brother, as I picked up the hat to examine it more closely. It was an old straw hat that smelt of mildew, and it really was in bad condition. All of a sudden, my attention was drawn away from the hat and diverted towards a long vertical blob of white, bobbing up and down in the water like a floating log. What was that? I bent over the water to examine the enigmatic curiosity more closely. It certainly was sizable enough to grab my interest, but what was it? I forgot about the enigmatic invisible stranger on the riverbank, who must have been responsible for throwing the hat in the water. Now my focus was completely on what the funny thing was that was in the water. We ran towards the object to get a better look, and to my amazement, we discovered that the large white blob was a white mannequin, wearing a white dress that looked like a nightie. I had seen mannequins like this before, in the ladies' wear section of the department store where my mother regularly bought her clothes. But what was a doll doing in the water with her hands and feet tied up, and a plastic bag tied over her head? I mean, how sick do you have to be to do something like this to a doll? My mother had always warned me that there were some unhinged people in this world. She wasn't wrong about that. Me and my brother eagerly broke open the plastic bag, and a head covered in auburn hair flopped back into the water. A female head, with glazed glassy eyes that reminded me of a dead fish. I looked at my brother in confoundment. I don't think this is a doll. I think it might be a dead body, I said to him, my eyes growing wide like saucers. I poked the body with a stick to make sure it was real. I realized it was not made of plastic, but of flesh and blood. It was the first time me and my brother had ever encountered a dead body. I didn't know how to react to what I was seeing. It was as if I was suspended in an alternative reality. My brother let out an ear-piercing scream and hurriedly ran through the water as fast as he could, grabbing his shoes and socks on the river bank and running away in his bare feet towards the cabin. I was so shocked that I couldn't scream at all, nor could I even run. And that was when I saw him. He was standing on the riverbank watching me curiously. The creature, or the being, or whatever you'd like to call him, was about 10 foot tall, with powerful ponderous shoulders, overlong arms, and a pyramid-shaped head. He was covered in long flowing hair that was blacker than a raven's feathers, and his face was incredibly human. He stared at me for a brief moment, nodded at me courteously, and then disappeared into the trees, and was gone. What the hell was that? It was the most intimidating thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. I was sure that this was the stranger who'd thrown the hat into the water strategically to draw our attention to the dead body. Had this hairy-looking man killed this woman, covered her head with a plastic bag, tied up her hands and feet? Would he do the same to me and my brother? Oh, my God! I needed to get the hell out of these woods as fast as I could. I didn't want to end up drowned in the water like this poor woman. It was now my turn to scream. I ran as fast as I could through the woods towards the cabin, my legs crumbling beneath me, while glancing briefly over my shoulders to make sure that this hairy giant was not running behind me. But I was relieved to see I was not being followed. My breath fast and furious, my heart pounding so loudly that it even obliterated the thunderous sounds of the water. I was completely out of breath when I reached the cabin. Me and my brother blasted through the cabin door, our faces as white as sheets, our bodies shaking like trees in a windstorm that could not be tamed, even after the wind had died down. Aunt Patsy looked concerned. Goodness gracious me! What on earth is the matter with the both of you? You look like you've encountered a ghost, or as if you've been chased by a mountain lion. What has happened? For some reason, me and my brother could not talk. Words failed to plop out of our mouths. It was almost as if our tongues were tied. It was only after much coaxing by my persuasive aunt, along with a couple of glasses of sweet Coca-Cola, I managed to finally blurt out, "There's a murderer in the woods! He's big and hairy! He killed a woman! She's floating in the stream! She has a bag over her head and her hands and feet are tied up! She's remember my Aunt Patsy went green. "What?" she gasped, throwing her hands over her mouth. "A dead body? In the wood grove?" What happened next is impossible to really remember, as the events in my mind are a little sketchy. But I remember men, rather like ants, dressed in white, descended upon my uncle and aunt's property, and a man my uncle described as a coroner arrived on the scene. He talked to the police for ages. I observed a large gurney containing the deceased woman, who was now covered in white sheeting, being squirreled away in a coroner's van. Then, of course, there were the police, who spoke to my aunt and uncle at length. I kept hearing the words, "Missing person. Yellowstone National Park. It's definitely her. The face is the same." I was surprised when a day later or so, my aunt informed me that a man called Detective Reese Bartholomew wanted to speak to the both of us. It made me feel really important that a real-life detective wanted our attention. The detective was a man in his early 50s, lean and streamlined, with a receding hairline and dark, very discerning eyes that were as astute as a bald eagle's. He gave me a large grin as he sat down opposite me and my brother at the long oakwood dining room table in the cabin. I noticed he had large hands, and he had a notepad of paper and a pen where he began scribbling down notes furiously fast. "Now, young man, your name is—" "My name is Scott. I'm 12 years old. This is my brother Rolf. He's 8. "I understand congratulations are in order for the both of you. You boys have solved a missing persons case. You need to be commended for that. Could you tell me how you stumbled across the lady's body?" I was keen to answer the detective's questions, my chest puffed up with pride, as I recounted our incredulous story. All the while, the detective's eyes remained focused on me. "Me and my brother Rolf here, we were playing by the stream. The stream's very noisy. All of a sudden, something flew over our head. I wasn't sure what it is. Well, sorry, what it was. I thought it might have been a bird. But whatever it was, it just dropped into the water. We could see it floating on the surface. We ran towards it to see what it was. It was an old straw hat, you see. I mean, it was really old. It was coming apart. The straw was frayed. It smelt really horrible. It was then that we retrieved the hat. Well, after we picked up the hat, we observed a white thing bobbing up and down in the water like a log. We discovered it was a mannequin from a ladies' department store wearing a plastic bag over its head. But we took the bag off and we realised that it wasn't a doll after all. It was a dead body. Oh, I was so scared, sir. But I couldn't run. I mean, Rolf could run. He ran back to the house as fast as he could. You see, we'd never seen a dead body before, sir, so we were ever so scared. I was the only one, of course, to see the murderer. I mean, he was standing there on the river bank, nodding at me. Oh, he was so big, sir. Really, really big. A hairy man. The detective seemed amused as the corners of his mouth began to twitch. "I doubt you saw the murderer, young man. You must have seen someone else standing on the river bank. I'm glad to be able to tell you we arrested the murderer at his home in Atlanta yesterday morning. The young woman you discovered was suffocated to death by her boyfriend, Theodore Maximilian. He has since confessed to the crime. He was staying at the Yellowstone National Park with his girlfriend, Isabella, known to her friends as Izzy. It would seem he had a fight with Izzy in the evening, but he refuses to disclose what the fight was about. Suffice to say, the coroner discovered a fetus in her womb, so we suspect she told her boyfriend that she was pregnant, and all hell broke loose. Anyway, things probably got very heated and out of hand, and he put a bag over her head to suffocate her, tying up her hands and feet, so she couldn't remove the bag from her head. So she died from suffocating to death. He threw her body in a large body of water at the Yellowstone National Park, where we can't be sure. He reported her missing to the authorities, claimed he woke up in the middle of the night in his tent to hear a loud roaring sound that he believed unequivocally was a mountain lion, and he heard a woman's screams. He was to discover his girlfriend missing, and that happened about 2 days ago. Of course, he made the fictitious story up, as you well know, so that we would assume her body had been mauled and eaten by a mountain lion. Even though the authorities did doubt his story, they were suspicious he had done something to his girlfriend. He had a long rap sheet, you see, of violent crimes behind him. I hasten to say, the big conundrum is, how did this young woman end up here in a stream in your woodgrove 2 days later? The mind boggles, but thanks to you young boys, you have solved a missing persons case. If you hadn't discovered her body, maybe she'd never have been found, and her boyfriend could have gotten away with murder, and her own parents may be still wondering what happened to her. We solved a crime, I asked the detective, like the famous 5. You did indeed, son. Well, you both did, didn't you? As I say, you should be proud of yourselves. After the detective left the cabin, I pondered a great deal over the large hairy man that I'd seen, watching me in the woodgrove. He must have been the one that threw the hat in the water at us, to show us where the dead body was located. He wasn't a murderer after all. He'd helped us to discover a missing person. We had been informed we could now play in the woodgrove, again because the police were now satisfied with the investigation, and we were free to do as we wished. My aunt and uncle were proud of our discovery, as they kept telling us that the family missing their beloved daughter was finally able to lay their loved one to rest. Do you have any idea, Scott, my Aunt Patsy told me, how much Isabella Patoma's family would have suffered greatly, wondering what on earth had happened to their daughter at Yellowstone National Park? They probably suspected her boyfriend was involved in her disappearance, but couldn't prove a thing, as did the police. But without a body, her boyfriend would never have been arrested, and her family would always be wondering what had happened to her. Was the boyfriend responsible? Did a wild animal attack her? But thanks to the 2 of you, they now have all their answers. My only worry is that you 2 boys might feel rather upset about having seen a dead body. I mean, it's not going to give you nightmares, is it? That is my worry. Of course not, Aunt Patsy. I mean, she looked like a doll, didn't she? Why would I be afraid of a big doll? I see them all the time at the apartment store when my mother goes shopping for clothes. I mean, when I knew she was a dead body, it was scary, of course, because I've never seen a dead body before, but she wasn't actually scary, if you know what I mean. I think I know what you mean, said my aunt, nodding. One day, when me and my brother were fast asleep in the cabin, exhausted after another high-spirited day exploring the woodgrove, we were awoken to a strange tapping sound at the bedroom window, as if something or someone wanted to get our attention. My brother, whose slimline single bed was parked directly under the windowsill, bounced up from his duvet like a jack-in-the-box, eager to investigate the rather peculiar sound. "What was that?" he asked me, his blue eyes growing as round as saucers. "Did you hear that, Scott?" he asked me. I nodded. I watched my brother from my bed, as he stood up on his bed in his pyjamas, that I seem to remember were covered in little boats. It's funny the details you can remember, as absurd as they can be. He pulled back the rather flimsy curtain. For a moment he stood still, staring out of the window, and then turned around at me, looking at me through bemused, half-shut eyes that were still cluttered with the debris of sleep. "Did you see that, Scott? There was a face looking at us in the window, with yellow eyes. Did you see it?" "Are you sure?" I asked him. "I didn't see anything from here." "I think I'm sure," he said, looking befuddled. It happened so quickly. Do you think I might have imagined it? I was sure I saw a pair of yellow eyes." He was caught between sleep and wakefulness, so he was somewhat confused. But one thing we had not imagined was the tapping at the window. It was the tapping that had woken us up after all. For some reason, after having solved the missing case of Isabella Patoma, me and my brother had an inflated sense of confidence, and we were reasonably puffed up with self-congratulation in terms of our remarkable find. It was hard not to let such an amazing discovery go to our little heads. I had visions of standing up in my classroom at school and telling my entire class how I'd solved a missing persons investigation. Imagine how impressed they would be. In my head I could see their faces staring up at me in wondrous awe. Everyone would want to make me their new best friend. I was sure of it. Who didn't want to hang around a friend who attracted adventure to them, like iron filings to a magnet? I think me and my brother had likened ourselves to the heroes in the famous five, although we would have fully appreciated a dog like Timothy that the fictional female character George owned in the series. Looking back, I unequivocally believe that seeing an ambiguous face staring in at us at the window, well, staring in at my brother, that is, before our discovery of the deceased woman floating in the stream, would have left the both of us diving for cover, crawling to our beds, burrowing beneath our duvets, begging for the morning to swiftly return, and the darkness to fade. We would have held our bladders until they were bursting, crossing our legs until the morning broke. We would have been petrified, but not any more. We were investigators, just like the famous five were after all. If George and Timothy in the famous five series had seen a strange face staring in at them through the window, they would not have allowed fear to cloud their curiosity in a murky, ambiguous fog of uncertainty. No, they'd have wanted answers now and stopped at nothing to get them. George would have been investigating that curious face at the window, and I told my brother as much. Me and my brother, much like the fictional character George in the famous five, would do the same as George would have done, or at the very least try to find out who or what had been tapping at our window. We knew it would be marginally nippy outside, so we hurriedly threw sweaters on over our pyjamas and placed our feet in walking boots. The cabin was quiet as a church mouse. Me and Ralph discreetly slipped out of the door that led onto the small little front porch. We ambled down the steps onto the undulating turf that welcomed our boot-clad feet. It was wet to the touch, as the ground was covered liberally with dew, so the bottom of our pyjama pants became quite soaked. We did this often enough, getting out of bed in the middle of the night at the cabin, sometimes at the most unseemly hours, to answer a call of nature, to relieve our full bladders. So if my aunt had heard us stumbling around the cabin a little noisily, she wouldn't have been worried about that. She would assume that that's what we were doing. We were going to the outside porta-potty, so to speak. In the beginning, trips to the porta-potty at the dead of night had been a wee bit intimidating, to say the least, and both me and my brother had accompanied each other on these nightly visitations. I was fast becoming used to the dark. It was quite exhilarating staring up at the Milky Way, listening to the trills of the crickets and frogs. We both carried torches in our hands that Aunt Patsy had given us to use should we need to answer a call of nature. She was always saying it was extremely good for us to go out of the cabin in the middle of the night to use the outside facilities. It would make us soon realize that the darkness was not to be feared. My Aunt Patsy told us that she had grown up terrified of the dark. She believed such a crippling impediment could have been overcome if she'd faced her fears head-on. If I'd been forced to use a porta-potty outside our house, she told me, I'd have overcome my fears very fast. But growing up, my parents accommodated my fears, instead of helping me to face them. Now that me and my brother were outside of the cabin, we both flashed our torchlight over the undulating flowery turf that surrounded the cabin on every side. We were looking to see if we could see any sign of the creature with the yellow eyes, the face that my brother claimed to have seen staring at him through the window, but nothing was there. But we did see a large smudge on the bedroom window that had not been there before, which confirmed something or someone had indeed been pressing their face against the window. So maybe my brother had not imagined the face he'd seen after all. All of a sudden, me and my brother could hear what I can only describe as the sound you'd expect to hear in a monastery. It really sounded as if you could hear monks chanting. It was incredibly bizarre. "What is that strange noise?" asked my brother, his little eyes growing round. I think it's coming from the woods. I'm scared. I think we should go back inside. I don't like the sound. It's giving me the creeps. I straightened up my back and puffed up my shoulders. Do you think that George in the famous five would run and hide in her bedroom like a big baby, Rolf? And she was a girl, not even a boy. But you're acting like a girl, like a really big scaredy cat. I wonder what she would think of you. I bet she'd never allow you to become part of the famous five. I mean, you can only belong if you're brave. But I am brave, said my brother, and I'm not a scaredy cat. Good, because we're going to do what the famous five would do. We're going to find out who is chanting in the woods. It's a mystery, right? And every mystery needs to be solved. My brother, fancying himself as one of the fictional characters in the famous five, and modelling himself on Julian, forgot his apprehension. So we both ambled over the grass towards the woodgrove, our feet scratching the undulating terrain and brushing against the closed petals of the yellow bells that in the morning would cover the landscape in a breathtaking carpet of yellow flowers. The moon that night was like a round white disk in the sky that rather reminded me of communion bread, only it was bright and luminescent. It magnanimously cast its silvery beams over the landscape, subduing the darkness significantly. But the trees of the woodgrove were ambiguously obscure, so their dark, lofty silhouettes were not clearly discernible. Me and my brother moved through the trees, tapping the earthen soil with our feet, brushing against ferns and shrubs, occasionally seeing yellow eyes low on the ground, staring at us and dashing quickly away, which were probably raccoons or foxes. Thankfully, they did not scare us. What would have scared us was noises like breaking of twigs or crackling of leaves, especially if we didn't know who was making that noise. That would be far more disturbing. We moved through the woods, guided by the light of our torch. The chanting became louder and louder and louder. We were getting very close to the sound. The closer we got to the chanting, the more I regretted persuading my brother to come into the woods with me. But if I showed him I was spooked and wanted to turn around and go back, then I really would be a hypocrite, and my brother would see that among the two of us, I was the scaredy cat. As the older brother, I had appearances to keep up, so I had to act as if I was fearless. I didn't want my little brother to glean for a second that I was becoming increasingly disquieted. That was when we saw them. It looked like 6 giant figures, covered in long flowing dark hair, identical to the large hairy man I observed on the riverbank the day me and my brother discovered the deceased corpse of Isabella Patoma. I indicated for my brother to hide behind the tree as we watched the 6 hairy men marching in a circle and chanting in a strange language I did not know. I couldn't comprehend what they were doing, but they were all wearing necklaces of feathers around their necks. Makilate amola nina lopaliata nutalagata milasika hopa silanita. I believe they were eagle's feathers, as they matched the ones in the Indian headdress my mother had purchased for me recently. That was when we saw in front of our very eyes a big round ball of yellow light, manifesting itself in front of the hairy men. They kept chanting, and then 2 more balls of light appeared. Manitalata malinakala natalatwa sikalanata pola sinakilato. I know now they are referred to as light orbs. We watched as the balls of light became airborne and seemed to float up in the sky like bubbles until they were gone. And after that happened, the chanting suddenly stopped. For a moment, everything went deathly quiet. Even the trills of the crickets and frogs had stopped, as if they too perceived that the music needed to hold its breath for a brief moment. I hasten to say that even the soft wind that had been blowing against our faces seemed to subside, as if it also knew it was not welcome to rudely intrude on this moment. The biggest hairy man, who was easily 9 foot tall, took command of the small audience and spoke to them in a booming voice in a strange language that I'd never heard before. But his eloquent words almost vibrated through me.
Matilati kasana tolabakisi, holina sogalina tua sakanati, habilata kasi, hamutokalanitawa.
What happened next is all the humongous figures turned around to look at the tree where me and my brother were hiding. So we were faced with over 6 pairs of blazing yellow eyes at about 7 foot off the ground, staring in our direction. There are no words to describe how terrified I became. Oh my God! They knew we were here! All the air in my breath was sucked out of me in an instant. As my chest tightened, my body became numb with fear. It was as if my whole body was encased in cement, and I couldn't move even if I tried. I knew I should run away. I knew that both of us should run away. But I was frozen to the spot, my hands clammy and wet. The hairs on the back of my neck were prickling me, and my brother was clutching me so tightly that his nails were digging into my skin. He was physically wobbling like a jelly. And that was when we heard the sound of heavy, ponderous feet, trespassing across the ground, moving directly towards the tree, where me and my brother were surreptitiously hiding. Our cover was clearly blown. My head was screaming, "Run, Scott, run, run!" But my body stubbornly refused to cooperate with my internal cries. I remained rooted to the ground like a tree. Then there he was, standing before me, lofty, tall, majestic. We looked up at him with terrified eyes. This powerful, hairy man was the most intimidating being I have ever beheld, with muscles on his arms that would make Arnold Schwarzenegger's biceps seem pathetically puny. The strapping man was just titanic in every imaginable way, but his face was so human as yours or mine. The hairy man's voice boomed as he spoke to us in a foreign language that I was about to tell him I did not understand. But then the most curious thing happened. The meaning of his words just floated into my mind like a leaf on the water, and I understood everything he was saying.
Matila tikatola nisakwi kalasa fushonakasi, lo manitalako. I'm very glad you came, my friends. We were expecting you to join our ceremony this evening. Pilati lakotapanasa hakotalinato. You will be glad to know she is now at peace. She was picked up by her previously deceased loved ones, but she wanted you to be here before she went away. Patilato ha nikalatona hasilatila kolami shakasi.
I don't understand what you're talking about.
Dolaki atamaki humpa silafo bolaki nato amatila sakwa. Don't you remember? Said the hairy man. Is your memory so scant? Remember I threw the hat in the water so that you could find her body.
Yes, you mean Isabella Patoma.
Dilanikata likato ha silafi himota sanakatwi. That is right. She was killed by her partner. Her soul was troubled. Milatina kona pasinakwa hitilati kalafasina so galazinas. We helped her to cross over the other side. We called over a couple of her deceased family members to help with the transition. When someone has been killed, it is hard for them to leave the earth plane. Sometimes they need help. They aren't prepared to go, you see. Matilati aginaso natila silatila ko alina izanikwa. I'm glad to see you came here to see it all. She wanted to thank you for giving her family closure. She did not want to leave the earth plane, but we have encouraged her to go along on her way. In our closing ceremony, her time on the earth plane has closed its curtain for her. She has moved on to the next part of her adventure.
As he said this, the 5 other hairy creatures surrounded us and nodded at us, as if they were affirming what the large man was telling us.
Mitalika, ho manasina, holinakina tola misa, shinatila fakanakwi. Now you must forgive me. We need to get going.
And with that, the hairy men just glided away, leaving me and my brother staring at each other in wondrous awe.
See, I said, aren't you glad we came into the woods? We solved the mystery of the strange chanting. We now know who was making that noise, and more to the point, we know why. They were helping that dead lady to cross over to the other side.
It was only later in life I was to learn that the idiosyncratic creatures me and my brother encountered were indeed Bigfoot. We had never known what they were before, so we had an answer to our curious conundrum. When my parents came back from Africa, my resentment dissipated because me and my brother had enjoyed an adventure that we would never forget, and one we were so glad to have enjoyed. My aunt and uncle still own the cabin in the woods. They're significantly older now, and have got used to all the things Mr. Bellingham warned them about, that they would experience the strange chanting sounds from the woods, whistling, the feeling of being watched. And Aunt Patsy has often seen the strange face at the window with the yellow eyes. Me and my brother have a vague idea what she might be seeing. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.